Hello and welcome to Xendee University Week 2026. As we kick off the event, just wanted to quickly express gratitude to this distributed energy community for coming together and making this event possible. With 22 sessions across 5 days and nearly 50 presenters or panelists, this is a true community, industry community event. It took everybody coming together to make it possible. So thank you for that. Two housekeeping items quickly. First, we will do about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. So please send in or submit your questions through the Zoom app here during the session. We'll be watching those and we will get to as many of those as we can. Any that we can't get to, we will follow up by email. And we do have a packed schedule today, so we will need to end on time. So plan on that. And without further ado, we'll now move right into the opening session of the week, the future of microgrids, which is moderated by Martine Jenkins, editor of Latitude Media. I will let her introduce her and the panelists further. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Trent. Welcome everyone to the first day of Xendee University. As Trent said, my name is Martine Jenkins. I'm an editor on the news side at Latitude Media. We're a media company. We cover the new frontiers of the energy transition. In addition to the news side, we also have podcasts, events, and research. Thank you to our 4 panelists for being here. I have some questions for each of you to get started. When I get to you, please briefly introduce yourselves and the company you work for and then at the end of the session, it's going to be about 50 minutes. We'll save about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And as Trent said, again, feel free to just drop those in the chat as they come up. So John, I would like to start with you. John Follett is the Director of Engineering at Mayfield Renewables. John, Mayfield is an engineering firm, which means you're kind of the essential piece that actually gets the project from concept to steel in the ground. From your perspective, what is the single biggest gap between what developers think a microgrid will take to execute and the reality, especially in today's market?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. As an engineering firm, we touch hundreds of projects every year, either in feasibility and planning or design or owner's engineering. And I'll just tell you, and I'm telling everyone who will listen, that for microgrid projects, complexity is always underestimated by all parties. And what that looks like in terms of gaps, probably one of the biggest one is that there's just not enough planning, upfront planning. That's how you handle complexity. And if you don't properly handle the complexity, then projects are late, over budget, and they do not deliver on the premise benefits to all parties. So that's the site host, the developer, the financier. So that would be the gap. And I have examples we can get into later, but that's what I would say.
Beautiful. Stet Sanborn is the VP and Director of Climate Impact at SmithGroup. SmithGroup sits a bit earlier in the process at the project conception stage. What are those early conversations like? Are clients walking through your door asking for microgrids by name? And if so, is that a change from how things have happened historically?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, as you mentioned, we're an AE firm. We do a lot of utility master planning, both for utilities and large portfolio owners. I would say that a very small fraction of our client base actually directly says, I would like a microgrid. Normally, they're asking us for energy stability, a hedge against cost escalations within their utility sector. They might be looking for power reliability. Usually it's one of the other benefits that a microgrid can provide that they're asking for that might actually steer us into that pathway. But then there are the ones that we really do enjoy where they say, hey, I want a microgrid. And we're like, great, what flavor? So today I'm hoping that we can kind of talk through all the nuances of different types and what they can do.
Awesome. Markus Virta is the co-founder and managing partner at Cascadia Renewables. Markus, Cascadia has been building community resilience projects in the Pacific Northwest. But I understand you guys made the transition from residential solar to more complex microgrid projects in the last couple of years, which obviously has been a period of huge policy upheaval. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision to I guess not pivot, but expand your focus, and kind of what that transition looked like technically speaking?
Yeah, it actually was a full pivot. So I left the residential EPC that I'd been with for 12 years in 2022 to found Cascadia Renewables. And we did it for a number of reasons. To John's point, a lot of projects we were seeing come across our desk that were government or community projects were underdeveloped and lacked the kind of preliminary planning that they needed to be truly representative and supportive of the communities we wanted to help. So that was the key there. What does it look like transitioning from residential and small commercial to microgrids? Just relentless learning, curiosity, and hard work. I mean, it is no joke that these projects are complex, but they're incredibly flexible and meaningful as well, and exactly the tools we need at the distribution system right now. So it's been a joy learning at the pace that this industry has required us to for the last 4 years.
And on that note, I'd like to turn over to Michael Stadler, who's the co-founder and CTO of Xendee. You're our host, so I'm going to look to you for some level setting. Big picture, how are microgrids currently being used in the US? Kind of in what regions of the country, in what contexts? Just briefly, we'll get into the details later. You're muted, I believe.
So good. Thanks, Lisa. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're calling in. So the thing is, most of the time we think about microgrids as a US market, but before I jump into the US market, Lisa, I mean, yes, the US market is the biggest market with microgrids, but it's actually followed by Asia and Europe. So we have 30% market share in Europe on microgrids. So it's not only a US topic, but the big topic in the US at the moment is, of course, data centers, as everyone knows, and we're in an exponential growth with data centers, and they're really changing the market at the moment for us. So, I mean, it hasn't felt like it feels today for a long time, and it really takes off because of microgrids, also because of the data centers. And in terms of regions, originally we had mostly the microgrids on the West Coast and East Coast, but we did a study end of last year, and now microgrids are popping up all over the place, and it's almost evenly distributed all over the country.
Beautiful. So I'm gonna kind of divide our conversation going forward into two parts. The first is kind of status quo, level setting. What is the current state of microgrids? And then, obviously, this session is called The Future of Microgrids. I want to talk about the main drivers of the market's evolution, the main hurdles, kind of looking forward. So starting with the present, John, you said in your kind of intro that there is a need to embrace complexity, and also just the fact that microgrids themselves are becoming more complex. It seems to me, at least, that there's been a sort of a divide between the more traditional, more straightforward approaches, solar PV alone, for instance, and then microgrids that are employing more complex approaches and combinations of technologies. Where are you seeing that complexity show up on real projects? Is it like in the asset mix, the contract structures, offtake arrangements, control layer?
Yeah, the answer is yes, to be short. So just briefly, if you think about a single asset like solar and rooftop solar, really there's one use case, and that's have it generate as much as possible throughout the life of the project. Great. And then the contract structure for third-party financing is typically a PPA. So every kilowatt hour produced, you get paid for. Pretty simple. And then if you add a battery, you now have two assets, which you feel like, okay, maybe it's twice as complicated, but it's more like 5 or 6 times as complicated. Because the battery, it's not just keeping it running and operating, it's keeping it running and operating like the solar, but then also telling it to charge and discharge at the most optimal time, depending on how you plan to create value. Are you going to save the site host on their utility bill? Are you going to provide services to the utility through demand response programs? And also, so that's the premised use cases when you build the project. However, like we said, the market landscape is changing rapidly, and so the available use cases and opportunity to create value for an asset like storage or reciprocating engine, anything flexible, is only going to increase. And so it's complexity in the types of assets that are used and then the number of use cases. And in my view, the way I tell people to think about it is, okay, the complexity is sort of the number of assets times the number of use cases, right? So if you got 3 assets and they each have, 3 use cases, like 27, right? So it's a big number. And so that's one thing to think about. And then also on the commercial side, like how are you going to finance this, and what are the agreements going to look like between your financing party and between your site host? And so that's sort of high level. And a specific example is if you have a residential developer, sorry, Markus, not you per se, this is a different company that decides they want to get into commercial solar and storage. And so they start developing a project, and we have cases like this that come up. And then there was one specific one where we tell them early on, hey, you're going to need a controls vendor. You're going to need somebody to do controls for you. We don't do that, but you're going to need it. And we sort of have a list of things we know need to get done to make the project successful. And that's a big one that often comes up. And they're like, yeah, we're going to do that. Our battery vendor's going to do it. We'll figure that out. And we get late in the project, and winter is coming, and the ground is going to be frozen, and you have to get the battery in place in time. And like, okay, who's going to be the controls vendor? And they're like, what? You didn't tell us this, right? We told you someone has to do this. And that's just one example from a technical standpoint. So anyway.
It could be a redo of Game of Thrones, just entirely premised on how are you getting the microgrid up and running before winter.
Yes. Yeah.
Stet and Markus, I mean, I'm curious about everyone's take on this, but especially you two, technically speaking, what are the biggest areas of potential growth for microgrids? Something we talked about in the prep call was DERMS integration. Stet, I'll start with you.
Sure, and I know Markus has another sort of viewpoint. Definitely the distributed microgrids, I think, are huge because of the deployability, the ability for multiple homes, multiple businesses to do really very microgrids that are deployed on their asset and then be ganged together through an aggregator. I think that's a huge market because of some of the regulatory or time to market challenges that larger scale developments have. So that's one area that I'm particularly excited about. The other one is actually cross-domain microgrids. A lot when people talk about microgrids, when they ask us about them, they're usually hyper focused on electrical systems. They've tunneled into a battery and PV, or battery PV and a generator. Well, on the big campuses that we work on, they often have really large thermal networks as well. And thermal storage at a lower price point can provide a lot of the same benefits, and actually working integrated into a microgrid with electrical and storage and on-site generation is a just beautiful synergy of systems because they can actually help each other with both dispatch, but also changing even gear sizes and reducing first costs on the system. So I get super excited in that space. But to John's earlier point, it comes back to controls. If you think that battery PV controls optimization is the Wild West, throw in large thermal storage into that mix. And when you should dispatch storage versus chiller operations, there's very few battery manufacturers or optimizers that actually know the multi-domain curve of a chiller performance across its full spectrum. So but I see that as if we can crack that nut, we can actually deliver a lot more grid flex at a lower price point.
I think that's bang on, Stet, and I think that where this market is going is towards like really system automation and realized flexibility, not only behind the meter but at the distribution system. So I think pivoting a bit, we do a fair amount of consulting for utilities and utility programs nowadays. and just understanding the maturity of DERMS, which is the Distributed Energy Resource Management System that utilities are deploying, that sits underneath their ADMS, which is their Advanced Distribution Management System, and how those two are integrating and talking to each other, and what data needs to flow in and out of those systems to enable not only the best utilization of the distribution system, which everyone's talking about right now, and kind of the next generation of performance-based regulation for utilities, but also how can these assets be really flexible? And so when we think about building envelopes and we think about the distribution equipment, there's storage all over currently today, with building envelopes and our HVAC equipment and our building automation systems. And it's on us as an industry to really be innovating and pushing the envelope on where we can find flexibility and capacity and then deliver it back to utilities. And in my mind, it's on the utilities to really understand that value and reward it. Not necessarily through programs, but through more mature dynamic rate structures that can scale with the industry. That's one of the real missing links, I think, for us to be unlocked. But what's really beautiful about that is when we deploy these assets really intelligently, we can deliver capacity at the distribution system for quite a bit less than your traditional feeder, transformer, or substation upgrade. So the technology is here, and in the words of Jigger Shaw, deploy, deploy, deploy.
Well, and just to add to this, I think this is also something that we realized with our clients at Xendee. The projects are becoming more complex, right? And you're trying to capture way more value streams. And this is actually why we, in some extent, have this conference, because we are thinking that, just doing PV projects maybe with some batteries is not going to be the future. We have to capture, as you said, Stet, solar thermal. There will be also presentations during this conference about solar thermal, but it's just way more complicated than it was just a year or 2 years ago. But that's also the opportunity, because you guys always mention control, right? Which is absolutely true. But at the same time, if you're not simulating the control already in the design phase, you're setting yourself up for failure. And I think that's a very important point here to say.
And Michael, actually, I want to follow up on that. Would you say that the existing control technologies are capable of handling the complexity that you're talking about here, or is that an area where the technology needs to develop as well?
Well, I think if you ask 5 people, you will get 10 different answers on this. From my perspective, absolutely not, right? What we see in the market and what is also reflected in the comments here, people just don't think about control. They think about, let's build a microgrid based on the funding that I'm getting or the needs, and then later on to well, we need a control, and then they just purchase something probably, right? Which is completely decoupled from the planning phase, right? And actually, this is my point to Stet and Markus early on, the planning needs to reflect already the control strategy, and then later on, when you implement the control strategy, then it should follow the same principles. And of course, if you have multiple assets, generators, thermal, batteries, there's no way that you can do this with rule-based control, because you will miss the point, and you need a flexible system, which is probably to some extent AI-enabled, which enables forecasting, load forecasting, renewable forecasting, has some forward-looking capabilities. And this doesn't exist, at least in the commercial market at the moment, to some extent. And this is what is needed. And we did a survey, and I think I mentioned this already last year. And it's interesting because the PV and battery developers say, well, the control strategies are good enough. But then if you ask others with more complicated projects, they say, no, we need forward-looking capabilities. So there's already an indication from the industry that we need more sophisticated tools. And we can talk about this later on a little bit more when we get to this, maybe to this survey.
Yeah, I would chime in and just echo that a little bit, in that it's not just you need to figure out what your control strategy is today. There's also an ability that you're going to have to be flexible and to be able to adjust those over time. The market's going to change, time of use rates are going to change. And the beauty of storage coupled with on-site generation is that you have inherently something that can be flexed in different ways. and have different services, both grid services, but also, reliability services and things like that. But if you lock in and your control strategy can't flex over time and allow that, then you're going to be stuck in the same condition that we were in with just on-site PV, locked into a certain deployment strategy. So that long-term flexibility is key, and even being able to take your controls and maybe do some sensitivity tests to those forecast models.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just add on very briefly that there is this disconnect between the long-term operators of the system and the developers oftentimes that are putting together the business case for the microgrid. And I think that's what you're getting at a bit, Michael, is that we need to have line of sight between whatever we're using to plan out the business case of how we're going to operate the asset and a real control system that could actually put that in practice and what kind of information is available to it.
This is something we touched on in our prep call, and there was some impassioned debate on this subject. To what extent are utilities, and especially kind of the utility incentive structure, actually set up to invest in these tools that would kind of make best use of a microgrid? Like, is that a hurdle that you guys are all facing? Stet, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can chime in. I would say it's an evolving market, and it's extremely geographic as to where utilities are in their both excitement, enjoyment, or even willingness to entertain interconnections with microgrids. But that also goes back to just large interconnection constraints that we have across the board. So as an example, we have a really large campus in California that is looking to double their enrollment, double their size of their campus, which will necessitate a new feeder, new 21 kV feeder, 10 megawatts, 20 megawatt, 21 kV feeder being brought in. The utility planning sort of interconnect queue for that is 5 to 6 years. That is a non-starter for most finance projects. Like if you go to a bank and you say, hey, I'd like to lock in something now, you won't see it for 6 years. And so, one of our solutions that we brought to the team was we actually said, okay, we can get you through your immediate power constraints with on-site generation and storage. We can deploy a microgrid now that gets you through this buffer period. And to Michael's earlier point about that modeling and testing, one of the benefits that we actually could bring to the utility to help reduce that queue was rather than the normal application where you might provide a peak summer day, weekend peak, maybe shoulder season, peak day load, weekend load, and then wintertime. We actually provided full 8760 profiles for every month going out for the next 20 years. Like we could do the modeling, we could do the forecasting. We said, we'll give you all the information as a utility that you need, because we understand from their side, they're understaffed, they're trying to figure out all these interconnections. And from an engineering standpoint, they're scared to death about bumping up against their feeder constraints or their substation constraints, where it's happening within their thing. And so we actually, because we could do that full detailed modeling of an entire campus out through 2050, with all the phases kind of broken down, it gave them certainty that they were dealing with a team that actually knew what they were doing. And they could see when they were running up against the constraints that actually concerned them. And it actually wasn't the summertime peak, it was actually the shoulder season curtailment period. And we were like, great, we can bring a benefit to you to reduce that connection time. So they were able to cut a year off of that interconnection queue because of that additional information. Now, a year, and these guys will tell you, a year in sort of a project delivery standpoint is a lot of money. And so that was a huge benefit. But I'll just come back and say it is radically different in every utility jurisdiction that we touch in what their willingness to sort of even entertain these systems are.
I would jump onto that. I think everything you said is bang on. I would add, like it was a black box for me for a long time in my career, why these interconnection studies took as long as they did. And I think data is critical. Data is, everyone's talking about this, not just in our industry. Data is the currency of the future. That said, the utility paradigm is right now, system protections are a silo from system planning, which is a silo from system operations. And so if we're going to be, developing these dynamic, flexible systems that are on a new paradigm, we need to get those silos broken down inside of these utilities, and those folks working together in parallel efforts around system interconnection and integration. And data is really, really helpful to visualizing and understanding the problem so that you can deploy assets in a way that is dynamic and flexible for the distribution grid. It gets that much more complicated when you're dealing with, I think it's 20% of AHJs in this country right now have a moratorium on solar or storage. It's really difficult. And these communities can't be left behind in the planning either. And so that's really what we focus on, is trying to take these really, really technical, dynamic projects that are being developed at pace right now to meet our large load integration goals, and bring the community in so that they feel like these projects are something they're doing for themselves and not projects that are happening to them. So that takes some code switching, as you can imagine, between that community and the systems protection engineering team. But it's really important engagement and really important planning.
Yeah. I'm sitting a little bit on needles, John. Maybe you have a comment here, but I would like to throw something in here because it's. Stet said, well, in between, before the utility is ready, we're building a microgrid, right? But I have bad news here, because we notice from our clients like you guys, right, and from the studies and work that we are doing. Guess what? If you start with a microgrid, there's a good chance that you're not giving up on the microgrid anyway when the utility is coming back, because you're realizing you're doing cheaper and you have higher resilience in certain areas and reliability, right? And especially in the data center industry, where they're talking about 10 years to upgrade the system for the data centers, no one will come back in 5 or 6 years when they're ready and say, well, now I'm giving away my microgrid and I'm just going back to the utility. This is economically nonsense, because every analysis and project shows microgrids are cheaper than upgrading the infrastructure in this country, at least, right? So I just want to point this out, because there's a danger for utilities to miss a little bit the boat here.
I would add to that, Michael, that I think that utilities often get stuck on a single use case when they're looking at interconnection and analysis. And that's what's really important about these microgrids, like Stet said earlier, is there are so many different use cases that they can deliver. And the key is to understand and visualize those and be able to model them out into the system. So I really want to encourage anyone working in this space to be talking really closely with their local protections team, their system planning team and whatnot, and really be thinking about what is the full breadth of use cases that these projects can deliver, and how can we verify the delivery of those use cases and certify that delivery. That's how we get to advanced markets where these projects are not needing grant dollars. But I think, to Michael's point, they shouldn't, because they're already cheaper than the alternative.
So we've already kind of started jumping into kind of the hurdles and the bottlenecks, but I want to really clarify kind of what are the primary bottlenecks in this market that are either preventing or delaying projects from getting built. John, I want to start with you. I'm especially interested in kind of the technical bottlenecks. Like, what is like, are there technologies that you're not able to access? Like, what is happening that is keeping a project from getting built on time? And then Markus, I'd love to have you talk through kind of the policy regulatory side of things.
Yeah, so there's a few pieces there, and just building on top a bit of what has been said. In part, there's a bit of a challenge on the interconnection side with the strong incentive for grid reliability, and that's part of the DNA of the utility. It's a very hard job to do, and so I respect that and understand. But pivoting from that mentality to taking a bit more risk, or apparent risk, in order to realize some of the benefits. That's one piece. Second, you have a similar challenge, and I'll get to the technical one in the end. And you have a similar challenge that I've seen in my development. I have a development background as well. Is that a microgrid? The more things you can do, the more stakeholders and sponsors inside the site host you have to work with, right? And so if your microgrid is going to be creating bill savings, then you've got somebody who's responsible for buying electricity that has to sponsor the project. If it's also going to provide resilience to the site host, then you have to get someone in operations on board. And so the more things you plan to do with the microgrid, the more stakeholders you have to involve to sign off on the benefits and the business case for the project. And so there's a bit of complexity inside of the site host that you have to work with. And then from an underwriting standpoint, whoever's going to finance the project, you have entities that have a history and a background in financing solar or commercial solar with PPAs, and they sort of understand the risk profile of that asset class. But then when you go to a new asset class, which is batteries, for example, there's a whole different risk profile there. And there's a different set of risk mitigations that make a battery project bankable. And similarly for reciprocating engines that provide flexibility for microgrids. So that's three different asset classes with three different risk profiles that you have to mitigate for bankability. And then when you combine them, then you have a whole new thing with associated risks that are due to integration from a technical and a commercial standpoint. And so those are our pieces in terms of the maturity and the experience with site hosts, financiers with these different asset classes and mitigation so that they can have good investments. That's a bit of a challenge. From a technology standpoint, I would say that controls are still evolving. Battery storage in particular, which, that's one of them. It's becoming a more common flexibility asset, although reciprocating engines have been around a lot longer, as we know. Having the standard controls within the battery system, like what is the battery system going to do? What is the battery management system going to do? How's that interface with the plant controller? Right? As soon as you have multiple assets, you have to have a control system above that. But for safety and reliability, you can't rely on cloud controls for everything. So you have to have local controls. And then how does that interface with your cloud controls, which interfaces with the DERM system that Markus mentioned? Those are evolving solutions, and there's just not enough standardization available yet or experienced players in the market, is my opinion. And so we're working towards that. And, our goal is to try to help support, standards around what does good look like when you have all of these different parties that have to work together in order to make a reliable, bankable microgrid project. So that's my view on some of the hurdles. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say adding onto that, like IEEE 2030.5 was our first swing at that, and there is a whole host of interoperability issues, I think, that we're wading through there. So I'm hopeful that Open ADR 3 kind of addresses some of this, and we can start to work as grid citizens, as our microgrid operators and our controller manufacturers are integrating into the DERMS and ADMS products that are out there. I think regulation has a really important part to play here. And we've got some really interesting work for the audience going on in Oregon right now. If you aren't all aware, AR 681 is a PUC docket that's open in Oregon around microgrid interconnection and a kind of paradigm shift for the IOUs in Oregon, where we can essentially access data and do much of the interconnection study via a third party PE, and then develop a microgrid in the context of deferral value or grid constraints. So it's bringing up this whole kind of question around grid utilization and this idea of a utilization performance standard instead of a clean performance standard for utilities, as we try to bump them up from 15, 20, 30% utilization up to 50, 60, 70%. And so, it's asking questions that around kind of how do we measure dispatch and certify dispatch? How do we understand when capacity can be bought back from a large load on a constrained circuit, and when there's coincident and non-coincident demand peaks on a kind of a geographical region? So all of that, like we really need that early stage planning to understand where those opportunities exist. And then, in an ideal world, we've got utilities who are starting to look at microgrids as flexibility assets and are thinking to themselves, that $20 or $30 million substation upgrade we could buy another 10 years with a microgrid, and we can certify the dispatch of it through our Open ADR and our ADMS product. So I think the technology is all there. The hard part is getting the regulatory and the policy side behind the industry. And that's where I think, working together, you all on this call get this more than anything, but we need coalitions that are really bringing solutions to our utility friends and our utility regulators that show them like we can sprint if we have the right policy and the right regulatory platform in place.
Stet, a question for you.
Yeah.
How is the capital stack evolving kind of against this backdrop?
Yeah.
I think the Xendee survey found that ability to secure funding was kind of the biggest challenge that both microgrid and non-microgrid developers are facing. But I'm wondering if investors are kind of showing up differently than they used to. Are there new sources of capital evolving or emerging?
Yeah. I'd say, and John alluded to this a little bit earlier, it's when we start to move away from PV to multi-system microgrids, not only is the service offering what they can do changing, the equipment type and what its actual bankability is changing as well. And then there's the whole sort of pipeline of, is the regulatory framework that Markus just mentioned stable enough that then the market can sit on top of that and then become bank. So it's a multi-tiered cake where everyone's eating at the same time while they're baking it, which is we're getting a lot of stuff kind of all over our face in that situation. But when we look at like batteries in particular, it's really important to realize that you might be holding a certain reserve of that battery for a grid service like frequency support. And that you're not using that at the same time that you're using for your backup power or your resilience reserve. And then the other one might be another grid service. You might be doing voltage support. You might be doing some other ancillary service, even playing on the capacity market. All of those components are play into a different kind of market slice that has been built on a regulatory underpinning. So the capital stack, John mentioned this earlier, a typical financier or power purchase agreement vendor who comes in and says, I can give you solar. Great, that was so clean and easy. that was super tidy. Now we're saying, hey, we have this thing that can do 100 different things, but often not at the same time. And do I need it? And how much do I reserve? That's a much dirtier picture. And there's fewer players that are comfortable playing that in the finance market. What we're seeing in our portfolio is that we're also gaining interest, though, from the insurance market. So through parametric insurance vehicles, resilience bond measures, there's this whole suite of folks that are actually coming in not to finance a thing, but to finance an outcome. And that's a different space that we're playing in. And I would say it's more exciting because the folks that are coming from the insurance side understand risk exceptionally well. But they don't necessarily know which technology and how to deploy it to hit some of those risk profiles that they're trying to finance or back. So it is a very exciting time to be in this space because I actually do see some of that, some of the funding mechanisms shifting to be very much more guaranteed performance or results driven, which means you really do have to understand sort of those market conditions that you're playing in.
Yeah, and I would just say that it's critical in your feasibility and planning to understand, what are those use cases going to be? How do they compete with one another? Markus, getting back to measurement and verification, are they going to use a utility meter to measure performance? Right. Can you get a sub-meter to be used for the measurement and verification? That's just a simple change that would make some of these use cases a lot more bankable and achievable even on the utility side. So 100% planning and feasibility need to make sure that all of these things tie and they're in sync with whoever's going to fund the project. Yeah. Sorry, Michael.
I just wanted to add something here because we have mentioned a couple of times a study that we commissioned here at Xendee. So Lisa, you mentioned it. We didn't do a study. We commissioned it with energy change makers, and they surveyed 150 plus executives and engineers and decision makers in the utility space and in the microgrid space. And there were a couple of questions, and some of these questions were referenced already in this discussion. But the thing that we also found is that companies which just doing PV and battery projects are in deep troubles. 50% of those respondents said they have no real projects coming their way. While people who have multi-energy microgrids and multiple tasks and revenue streams, they have full books. So, and I think this is what you guys saying in different words, and we saw this in the survey. from energy change makers, that people who are willing to go and think about this more complex system actually making the money, and the others are somehow struggling to really get the projects going. And of course, it has also to do a little bit with the changes in the funding on the federal government level, I would say. But I just want to make sure that this was a study that not we did, it was done by energy change makers, and we surveyed the industry. And this is what Lise was referencing.
So we have exactly 10 minutes left. I am going to open it up to audience Q&A. We already have a few great questions that have come in, but now is your moment if you'd like to submit one. We have one from Stephen Pullins. Most of this discussion is about grid-connected microgrids behind the meter. What advantages are there to deploy a microgrid islanded from the grid and maybe do a grid connection later? And I'll just say it would be ideal for one, maybe two people to answer each of these, just so we can get to as many audience questions as possible. Does someone want to?
I mean, I'll jump in because we get asked this a lot because we do mission critical data center work, and obviously there's a power crunch and pipeline. I always come back to what are the project goals around reliability. That if you make the decision to do an off-grid fully island with no interconnect, then you're taking on a lot of the role that you have not realized the grid has provided historically in a really robust way around reliability. And so all of a sudden your on-site generation resources and the reliability to how many nines you're expecting your uptime to run, whether you're doing combined cycle gas turbines, whether you're doing battery, solar, we have some projects doing micronuclear, check that price point. But all of a sudden you're taking on roles that you need to make sure that you have operations folks that actually understand the extent to which it may look cheaper until you start to put your full team that needs to keep those systems up and running, and what each of those components backup plan is. Because even if you have resilient systems, you need resilient controllers, you need I'd be careful to bite that off unless you feel very confident that you have the team in place that are used to running a critical facility with one of the key backup elements not in place. That would be my warning to anybody who says, "Oh, isn't it faster and cheaper?" Okay.
I would add to that. I think, if you are taking that as a strategy, and speed to power is really important for a lot of these larger load customers, then more than likely you're already looking at a flexible interconnection tariff with the serving utility. So the idea of being able to off-grid for a period of time prior to getting that interconnection allows you to bring data with you. And I can tell you, having had a lot of conversations with these systems protections and planning folks, they're really frustrated by these large loads coming in saying, "Hey, I need 80, 100 megawatts." And then they interconnect and they only use 30. And there's all of this cost in bringing that interconnection in. So if you can actually come in with data saying, "Hey, I know exactly how much energy I'm using when and how much," then that flexible interconnection agreement can be far more rooted when you're going through that negotiation with the utility.
This is one I think is really interesting. Our utility refuses to touch any CNI microgrid until there are standards and listed products. What role does UL and NRTLs play in this transition? Does it seem like they are engaged in trying to keep up with the need? Are any of you guys working with UL?
I can make a start here on standardization. I mean, I think first of all, we are used to systems where we were thinking we know everything, right? When we had a utility system for 100 years and we think we know everything, and now we're getting a little bit touchy about, we're changing this and maybe there's some uncertainty. So I think we have to realize with microgrids, we need to be a little bit more flexible than we were in the past when it came to utility, because it's a very structured approach when it comes to utility. So first of all, I think a lot of people need to realize it's not something like, you go just to a vendor and you purchase a microgrid. It needs engineering, it needs some design, it needs some involvement. First thing. Second thing is, there is standardization going on. For example, the Department of Energy is standardizing microcontrollers. I mean, there's IEEE 2030.7. I think Markus already mentioned 2030.5. So standardization is out there, but I think it will be difficult if we wait that, oh, there's a microgrid certified technology, there's a microgrid certified controller. I mean, these things exist. And I think as it looks right now, I don't think that we'll have something like we go to a shop and get all these certified things right away. So I think that's a little bit of an illusion. And I think it's just tactics to avoid a microgrid, in my opinion, because we have done thousands of microgrids worldwide and they're working, right? I mean, are they perfect? No. So standardization is important, but expecting the same level of standardization like we have it now in the utility space might probably just slow it down at this moment, I would think. But maybe people have a different opinion on this.
I completely agree with you, Michael. I think so. I would encourage the question asker to look at the IEEE 2030 chapter and point their utility towards that. I also know that ARESCA is the American Renewable Energy Standards and Codes Association. They're working on some standards as well, built on the IEA body of work. So there's plenty of standards that are out there. My guess is this is a first of a kind project in this utility service territory. And anytime that's happening, again, it's broken record here, but going back to early planning and early engagement and really understanding what are the concerns from the protections team at that utility that they're trying to mitigate and alleviate. And chances are, you might have to upgrade your controller to one that has 2030.5 certification, or, they have experience with to bring down the temperature and give them a little bit more comfort. So I think that's where asking that question. Go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, I thought you were winding down, but I would echo what you're saying, Markus, is that when you're an AHJ that does not have experience with this technology, you end up with situations like this. That's why I think it's very important in feasibility early on to be able to essentially coach and level up your counterparty on the existing codes and standards that apply to the project.
Yeah, especially when you're working with some of the smaller utilities, co-ops, things like that. They don't have a 600-person engineering team in the back room. There's like 4 people. And so to the extent that you can come with your project and say, hey, I want to talk about what your constraints are, what you think your risks are within your system, and what services can we provide to actually help support that. And here's resources that are independent, third party, you don't have to trust me. Look, there's an entity over here that's already solved this. I don't know. I feel like a lot of folks treat their utilities and AHJs as somebody they don't want to talk to. I think that's the absolute worst approach to these projects. I think being really open and transparent and actually starting conversations really early avoids having a project just shut down at the end after you've invested a whole lot of money into it.
Yeah.
I would agree 100%. And we've had situations where, after working with the AHJ, then they use what they learned on the project for future projects. And so it's a win-win for everyone.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Regarding the future of microgrid architectures, do you foresee a shift toward fully distributed control, or will centralized dispatch remain the standard, particularly for islanded operation? More islanded microgrid talk.
Go ahead. Now you go.
I was going to say, I feel pretty strongly about this one, actually. So I'm going to come to defense of our utility partners here. I think it's really important to have a social institution that operates our grid, that operates it in a safe way, in a reliable way, and delivers power in an affordable manner. So I do not think that microgrids are a competitor to the utility paradigm. I think they are the next generation technology that will deliver power reliably and affordably. And our utility operators are incredibly important roles in society, and they need to continue to have control. Now, that said, in islanded scenarios where you've got nested multi-node microgrids, it gets technical really quickly, and it can get really personal when it comes to resilience and emergency operations. PNNL has some studies on how to do kind of multi-node dispatch with, in the context of the value of resilience and whatnot. I think they're leading a lot of really important thought there. But I do think that it's really critical that we not have illusions about who's operating our grid and who needs to continue to for national security.
But I need to add something here, because I think the question is a little bit also on the technical side where the controller resides. And of course, most of the microgrid controllers at the moment reside at the microgrid side in a centralized fashion. But as already pointed out, there are different standardizations. And for example, IEEE 2030.7 deals exactly with what Markus is saying, the link to the utility so that the utility can influence it. So I don't think the microcontroller should be on the utility side, but of course, it should interface with the utility so that the utility gets information behind the walls, basically what's going on. And I think a distributed control in the question means it's more like a system where these different entities negotiate a certain structure. They are not really standard at the moment. I know there's a lot of research going on in this area, and I would not be surprised if they're popping up at some point. But at the moment, I'm not sure if they will make a difference, the control structure, if a microgrid is successful or not, but I'm pretty sure they will pop up to some extent. But currently, I think it's all centralized. And most of the time behind the meter control.
Beautiful. That is actually all we have time for today. We could continue talking about this for hours, but thank you so much for being here for this first keynote panel. And I'm going to pass it back to Trent just to wrap things up.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to this panel and for sharing your expertise. This has been a great session. One last item. So we'll be ending this Zoom session. If you're registered for the next one, then you'll need to go to the invite for that session. You'll find a unique link where you can join that, and that's how we'll work throughout the week. Each session has its own link. So thank you, and see you on the next session.